The Galactic Imperium stretched across 14 star systems, ruled by beings whose very presence could melt starship hulls with their breath. The Draconian Empire had conquered worlds for over 3 millennia, their scaled forms striking terror into the hearts of countless species. Yet in the grand palace of Zephyros Prime, the most feared being in the galaxy sat helplessly beside a small bed. Emperor Vex Thanor the Terrible measured nearly 20 feet from snout to tail, his obsidian scales gleaming like polished armor in the artificial light of the medical wing. His golden eyes, which had watched civilizations rise and fall, now held nothing but desperate worry as he gazed down at the tiny form on the bed. Prince Kylvex was barely larger than a house cat, his usually brilliant crimson scales now dull and gray. The young dragon's breathing came in short, labored gasps, and his small chest rose and fell with obvious effort. At only 50 years old, practically an infant by draconian standards, the prince had been sick for nearly 2 years. "Your Imperial Majesty," spoke Dr. Zalthenis, the Empire's most renowned physician. His blue-scaled head bowed low as he approached. "The prince's condition continues to deteriorate. We have exhausted all known treatments within our medical knowledge." The Emperor's claws scraped against the polished floor. "You are telling me that the most advanced civilization in the galaxy cannot heal one small dragon?" "My lord, we have consulted with the greatest minds of our species, the quantum healers of Rigel Prime, the biomanipulators of the Vegan Collective, even the mysterious energy weavers of the Outer Rim. None can identify the source of the prince's ailment." Emperor Vexa Thanor's massive form trembled with barely contained rage and fear. In all his centuries of existence, he had never felt so powerless. He could reduce entire planets to ash, command fleets that blotted out stars, yet he could not save his own child. "Leave me," he rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. The medical staff filed out silently, leaving the Emperor alone with his dying son. The great ruler lowered his enormous head until it nearly touched the small bed, listening to each precious breath. 3 floors below, in the service levels of the palace that most of the aristocracy never saw, Thomas Chen pushed his cleaning cart down the narrow corridor. The human janitor had worked in the palace for nearly 5 years. Invisible to the draconian nobility who barely acknowledged his existence. To them, he was just another of the lesser species that maintained their grand buildings. Thomas didn't mind the anonymity. It paid well enough to send money back to the human colony ships still searching for a permanent home, and it gave him a front-row seat to observe one of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. As a former medical researcher who had lost everything when Earth fell to the draconian conquest, he found a strange peace in the simple work of keeping things clean. The service corridors buzzed with gossip among the staff. The Dragon Empire employed dozens of species in various capacities, and news traveled fast through the servant networks. Today, everyone was talking about the prince. "Poor little thing," whispered Mira. "A 4-armed Altarian who worked in the kitchens. They say he might not last the week." "Tragic," agreed Borek, a hulking Ursoid who maintained the palace's environmental systems. "All that power, all that technology, and they can't save one small dragon." Thomas listened while he sorted his cleaning supplies. He had heard rumors about the prince's illness for months, but the details were always vague. The Draconians kept their royal family's medical information strictly classified. "What exactly is wrong with him?" Thomas asked quietly. Mira's large eyes darted around nervously. "Nobody knows for sure. Some kind of wasting disease. The prince can barely eat, can't maintain his body temperature, and his scales are losing their color. The royal physicians are baffled." Thomas frowned, his scientific mind automatically analyzing the symptoms. "How long has he been sick?" Nearly 2 years now, Borek rumbled. Started when he was just a hatchling. The Emperor has spent fortunes bringing in specialists from across the galaxy, but nothing helps. As Thomas continued his rounds, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was being overlooked. In his years of research, he had learned that sometimes the most complex problems had surprisingly simple solutions. The dragon physicians were likely focusing on exotic diseases and rare conditions. But what if the answer was more basic? That evening, Thomas made his way to the palace's vast digital library. As a maintenance worker, he had access to general databases for equipment manuals and basic procedures. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He started by researching draconian physiology, reading everything available about their biology and development. Dragons were fascinating creatures, part organic, part energy beings. Their scales weren't just armor. They were complex organs that regulated temperature, processed certain types of radiation, and even helped with digestion. Young dragons, Thomas learned, required very specific environmental conditions to develop properly. They needed particular minerals in their diet, precise temperature ranges, and exposure to certain electromagnetic frequencies that helped their scales mature. As he read deeper into the research, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Many of the requirements for healthy dragon development had been discovered relatively recently in draconian history. Before that, young dragons often suffered from mysterious illnesses that physicians couldn't explain. Thomas leaned back in his chair, a theory beginning to form in his mind. What if the prince wasn't suffering from a disease at all? What if he was experiencing a deficiency, something missing from his environment that his developing body needed? The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. The palace was a marvel of technology, with artificial everything, lighting, atmosphere, even the food was processed and refined to perfection. But what if that perfection was actually the problem? Thomas knew he was probably wrong. He was just a human janitor with outdated medical training. The greatest minds in the galaxy had examined the prince and found nothing. Who was he to think he could solve what they couldn't? But he couldn't let it go. The next morning, Thomas made a decision that could cost him everything. Instead of following his normal cleaning route, he made his way toward the medical wing. Security was tight, but janitorial staff had access to most areas of the palace for maintenance purposes. His heart pounded as he pushed his cart through the corridors leading to the royal quarters. If he was caught where he wasn't supposed to be, best case scenario, he would be fired and deported. Worst case, he would be executed for approaching the royal family without permission. The medical wing was eerily quiet. Most of the staff had been dismissed, leaving only a skeleton crew of guards and one attending physician. Thomas knew from the servant gossip that the Emperor spent most of his time at his son's bedside, refusing to leave, even to attend to matters of state. Thomas found a supply closet near the prince's room and began the tedious process of cleaning it, taking much longer than necessary while he listened. Through the thin walls, he could hear the Emperor's deep voice, speaking softly to his son. "Fight, little one," the massive dragon rumbled. "You must fight." The sound of such a powerful being reduced to desperate pleading made Thomas's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. He had lost his own family when Earth fell, and he recognized the raw pain in the Emperor's voice. Taking a deep breath, Thomas made the most dangerous decision of his life. He stepped out of the supply closet and walked directly to the prince's room. The two guards at the door immediately raised their weapons, crystalline spears that hummed with deadly energy. "Halt! This area is restricted to authorized personnel only." "I need to see the prince," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. One of the guards laughed harshly. "A human janitor wishes to see His Imperial Highness. You will return to your duties immediately or you will be terminated." "I think I know what's wrong with him," Thomas continued, knowing he had only seconds before they either arrested him or worse. "Please just let me explain to the Emperor." The guard's expression shifted from amusement to outrage. The senior guard stepped forward, his spear crackling with energy. "You dare suggest that you know something the royal physicians do not? You will—" "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" The voice that interrupted was like rolling thunder, and Thomas felt his bones vibrate as Emperor Vexthanor emerged from the prince's room. The massive dragon filled the entire doorway, his golden eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made the human want to flee. Thomas forced himself to stand still as the most powerful being in the galaxy studied him. This close, the Emperor was even more impressive than Thomas had imagined. Every scale was perfect, every movement controlled and graceful despite his enormous size. The air around him seemed to shimmer with barely contained energy. "Your Imperial Majesty," the senior guard said, bowing low, "this human claims to have knowledge about the prince's condition. We were about to remove him." The Emperor's gaze never left Thomas. "Is this true, human? You believe you understand what the greatest medical minds in the galaxy cannot?" Thomas swallowed hard. "Your Majesty, I think your son might be suffering from an environmental deficiency rather than a disease. In my species' history, we've seen similar symptoms in our young when they're deprived of natural sunlight or certain minerals." A long moment of silence stretched between them. Thomas could practically feel the Emperor's rage building like pressure in a volcano. The air grew noticeably warmer, and small wisps of smoke began to curl from the dragon's nostrils. "You suggest," the Emperor said slowly, his voice deadly calm, "that my son is ill because of something so simple that we have overlooked it." "It's possible, Your Majesty. Sometimes the most complex symptoms have surprisingly basic causes. If I could just examine—" "Enough!" The Emperor's roar shook the entire corridor, and Thomas felt heat wash over him like standing too close to a furnace. "You dare presume to examine the heir to the Draconian Empire? You, a member of a conquered species, believe you can succeed where the greatest minds have failed?" Thomas knew he was about to die. The Emperor's eyes were beginning to glow with internal fire, and the smell of burning ozone filled the air. But the image of the small, dying dragon in the room behind the Emperor gave him courage to speak one more time. "Your Majesty, if I'm wrong, you can execute me. But if I'm right, and there's even a small chance I could help your son, isn't it worth trying?" The Emperor stared at him for what felt like an eternity. The heat in the corridor grew almost unbearable, and Thomas could see small flames dancing between the dragon's teeth. This was it. His life was about to end in fire and fury. Then, unexpectedly, the Emperor stepped aside. "You have one chance, human," he said quietly, his voice containing a desperate edge that few beings in the galaxy had ever heard from the mighty ruler. "If you cannot help my son, your death will be slow and painful. If you harm him in any way, I will ensure that your suffering lasts for centuries." Thomas nodded and walked past the Emperor into the prince's room, very aware that he had just committed himself to either saving a dragon prince's life or facing a fate worse than death. The room was surprisingly simple, despite being in the royal quarters. Medical equipment hummed quietly around a small bed where Prince Kylvex lay motionless. Thomas approached slowly, his scientific mind already analyzing what he could see. The young dragon was beautiful, even in his illness, his scales catching what little light filtered through the room's artificial windows. But Thomas could immediately see what was wrong, or rather, what was missing. "Your Majesty," he said softly, not turning away from the prince, "when was the last time your son was exposed to natural sunlight?" The Emperor's massive form went very still at Thomas's question. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the prince's labored breathing and the quiet hum of medical equipment. "Natural sunlight?" Emperor Vexthanor repeated slowly. "The prince has never been exposed to unfiltered stellar radiation." The palace's atmospheric processors provide perfectly controlled lighting conditions. Thomas nodded grimly. That might be the problem, Your Majesty. May I approach your son? The Emperor's golden eyes tracked Thomas's every movement as the human slowly walked to the bedside. Up close, the prince looked even smaller and more fragile than Thomas had expected. The young dragon's scales had a dull, grayish tint that spoke of serious malnutrition, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. Gently, Thomas extended his hand toward one of the prince's tiny wings. May I, Your Majesty? After a tense pause, the Emperor gave a barely perceptible nod. Thomas carefully touched the prince's wing membrane, feeling its texture and temperature. It was thin, almost translucent, and surprisingly cool to the touch. Dr. Zalthenis, the Emperor called, his voice still dangerous but now containing a note of desperate hope. Attend us immediately. The royal physician arrived within minutes, his blue scales pale with anxiety. When he saw Thomas beside the prince's bed, his eyes widened in shock. Your Imperial Majesty, surely you don't intend to allow this human to... Explain your theory, the Emperor commanded Thomas, cutting off his physician's protests. Thomas took a deep breath. Your Majesty, in human development, young children require exposure to natural sunlight to properly synthesize certain vitamins and develop strong bones. Without it, they develop a condition called rickets, weak bones, stunted growth, and immune system problems. Dr. Zalthenis scoffed. Ridiculous! Dragons are not humans. Our physiology is completely different. Yes, but look at this, Thomas said, gently lifting a small section of the prince's wing membrane. This tissue should be vibrant and strong. Instead, it's thin and discolored. And feel the temperature. Young dragons should run hot, shouldn't they? This suggests his metabolic processes aren't functioning properly. The Emperor leaned in closer, his massive head hovering just above the bed. Continue. I believe dragons might have a similar requirement for natural stellar radiation. Your son's scales aren't just protective armor. They're organs that process energy from sunlight and convert it into something his body needs for proper development. Thomas pointed to the prince's dull scales. Look at the crystalline structure. In healthy young dragons I've seen in the archives, these scales have a prismatic quality that helps them capture and process different wavelengths of light. Your son's scales have lost that ability because they've never been properly developed. Dr. Zalthenis stepped forward aggressively. Your Imperial Majesty, this is nonsense. This human has no understanding of our biology. Dragons have evolved beyond the need for such primitive requirements. Have they? Thomas asked quietly. Your Imperial Majesty, in your own youth, were you exposed to natural sunlight? The Emperor was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Yes, I was raised in the old ways before we built these enclosed cities. I spent much of my youth on my father's estate, where young dragons were expected to hunt and play in the open air under the true sun. And you're one of the strongest dragons in Imperial history, Thomas continued. But as your civilization has advanced, as you've moved into these perfectly controlled environments, have you noticed any changes in the health and development of young dragons? Dr. Zalthenis opened his mouth to object, but the Emperor silenced him with a look. The great ruler's eyes had taken on a distant expression as he considered Thomas's words. There have been concerns, the Emperor admitted slowly. In recent generations, young dragons have developed more slowly. We attributed it to the safety and comfort of modern life. No need to develop the survival instincts of their ancestors. What if it wasn't about survival instincts at all? Thomas suggested. What if it was about the environment itself? Thomas moved to the room's artificial lighting controls. Your Majesty, this lighting system provides perfect illumination, but it filters out many of the wavelengths present in natural sunlight. What if young dragons need those specific wavelengths for proper development? The room fell silent except for the prince's labored breathing. Dr. Zalthanis looked furious, but the emperor appeared deep in thought. Even if your theory has merit, the doctor finally said, the prince is far too weak to be moved outdoors. The unfiltered radiation from our star could kill him in his current condition. Thomas nodded. You're right, but what if we could simulate natural sunlight conditions in a controlled way? Start with very brief, very mild exposures, and gradually increase them as his condition improves? Impossible, Dr. Zalthanis declared. The palace's systems cannot replicate the full spectrum of stellar radiation. It would require specialized equipment that doesn't exist. Actually, Thomas said quietly, I think it does exist. I've been reading about the agricultural levels of the palace. They use full-spectrum growth lights for the rare plants in the emperor's private gardens, lights that simulate natural sunlight down to the smallest detail. The emperor's eyes sharpened. The botanical gardens. Yes, those lights were designed to maintain specimens from worlds across the galaxy. Each requires specific radiation wavelengths to survive. If we could move one of those lighting systems here, Thomas continued, we could create a controlled environment that slowly introduces natural light wavelengths. Start with just a few minutes per day and monitor the prince's response. Dr. Zalthanis stepped forward aggressively. Your Imperial Majesty, I must protest. This human's wild theories could endanger the prince's life. We should continue with established medical protocols. Your established medical protocols have failed, the emperor said quietly, but his words carried the force of absolute authority. My son grows weaker each day under your care. The physician's scales flushed a deep purple with indignation. Your Majesty, you cannot seriously consider it. I can, and I will. The emperor's voice grew dangerous again. You will assist this human in implementing his treatment plan. If he is wrong, I will hold you both equally responsible. If he is right? The emperor didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Dr. Zalthanis bowed stiffly and left the room, his tail lashing with barely contained fury. Thomas found himself alone with the most powerful being in the galaxy and his dying son. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a mountain. Human, the emperor said quietly. What is your name? Thomas Chen, Your Majesty. Thomas Chen. The emperor tested the unfamiliar syllables. You understand that if you are wrong, your death will be neither quick nor pleasant. I understand, Your Majesty. And yet you persist. Why? Thomas looked down at the small dragon on the bed. Because sometimes being right matters more than being safe. And because no child should die if there's something that can be done to prevent it. The emperor studied Thomas for a long moment. Your species is strange. You possess no great strength, no natural weapons, no exceptional intelligence compared to other spacefaring races. Yet you survived our conquest and continue to thrive in servitude. Why? Thomas considered the question carefully. Maybe because we don't give up easily, Your Majesty. When we see a problem, we keep trying to solve it, even when everyone else says it's impossible. Stubbornness? The emperor mused. Determination, Thomas corrected gently. By evening, the first full-spectrum lighting unit had been installed in the prince's room. It was a massive piece of equipment designed to simulate the exact radiation patterns of a dozen different star types. Thomas spent hours calibrating it with the help of the palace's botanical engineers, setting it to replicate the specific wavelengths of Zephyros Prime's sun. Dr. Zalthanis supervised the process with obvious reluctance, making notes and muttering under his breath about primitive superstitions and dangerous experimentation. We'll start with just 5 minutes of exposure, Thomas explained to the emperor. Low intensity, broad spectrum. If the prince shows any signs of distress, we stop immediately. The Emperor nodded, positioning himself beside his son's bed. His massive form was tense with anxiety, ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble. Thomas activated the lighting system, the room filled with warm golden light that felt somehow more alive than the sterile illumination they were accustomed to. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. The prince continued his labored breathing, showing no change. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. The prince's breathing seemed to deepen slightly, and a hint of color appeared to return to his dull scales. "There," Thomas said softly, pointing to the young dragon's wing membranes. "Do you see that?" The Emperor leaned closer, his massive head nearly touching the bed. The prince's wings had taken on a very faint, translucent quality, as if light was beginning to pass through them properly for the first time. "Is it working?" the Emperor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's too early to tell for certain," Thomas replied honestly, "but this is exactly what I hoped to see. His scales are beginning to respond to the light." Dr. Zalthenis approached with his monitoring equipment, taking readings of the prince's vital signs. His expression was skeptical, but Thomas noticed he wasn't objecting as loudly as before. "Metabolic activity has increased by 3%, the doctor reported grudgingly. "Body temperature is up 0.5 degrees. "That's good," Thomas said. "It means his system is beginning to process energy more efficiently." They maintained the light exposure for exactly 5 minutes before Thomas turned it off. The prince seemed to settle into a deeper, more peaceful sleep than they had seen in weeks. "We'll try again tomorrow," Thomas explained, gradually increasing the duration and intensity as his condition improves. "This isn't going to be a quick fix. His system has been deprived for too long. But if I'm right, we should see steady improvement over the next few weeks." The Emperor remained at his son's bedside through the night, watching for any change. Thomas dozed fitfully in a chair in the corner, starting awake periodically to check on the prince. Near dawn, Thomas woke to find the Emperor staring at him. "He slept through the night," the massive dragon said quietly. "For the first time in months, he did not wake crying in pain." Thomas felt a surge of hope, but forced himself to remain cautious. "That's encouraging, Your Majesty, but we need to be patient. Recovery will take time." Over the next week, they established a routine. Each morning, Thomas would carefully calibrate the lighting system and gradually increase the prince's exposure to simulated sunlight. Dr. Zalthenis continued to monitor the young dragon's vital signs, his skepticism slowly giving way to professional curiosity as the readings continued to improve. By the end of the first week, the change was undeniable. Prince Kylvex's breathing had improved dramatically, his body temperature had stabilized at healthy levels, and his scales were beginning to show flashes of their natural crimson color. "Remarkable," Dr. Zalthenis admitted grudgingly as he reviewed the latest test results. "Metabolic function has improved by 27%. Cell regeneration is accelerating. I have never seen anything like this." Thomas nodded, exhausted but hopeful. "The theory appears to be correct. Young dragons do require natural stellar radiation for proper development." The Emperor had barely left his son's side during the entire week. The feared ruler of the galaxy had become simply a father watching his child slowly return to health. "Thomas Chen," the Emperor said on the 7th day, using the human's full name with something approaching respect. "You have given me back my son." "Not yet, Your Majesty," Thomas replied carefully. "He's improving, but he's not fully recovered. It's going to take time to undo 2 years of deficiency." That evening, as Thomas was adjusting the lighting system for the next day's treatment, he noticed something that made his heart race with excitement. Prince Kylvex's eyes were open, and for the first time since Thomas had begun treating him, the young dragon was looking around with apparent interest. "Your Majesty," Thomas called softly. The Emperor immediately moved to his son's bedside. "Kyle Vex, my little prince, can you hear me?" The young dragon made a soft chirping sound, the first vocalization they had heard from him in weeks. His small head turned toward his father's voice, and his eyes focused with growing alertness. Dr. Zalthenis rushed to take readings, his excitement overcoming his professional composure. "Brain activity is spiking. Sensory response is dramatically improved. This is extraordinary." Thomas watched from a respectful distance as the Emperor gently nuzzled his son, speaking to him in soft Draconian. After months of watching the prince lie motionless, seeing him respond to his father's touch brought tears to Thomas's eyes. But Thomas also knew that their success had not gone unnoticed. Word of the human janitor who had succeeded where the Empire's greatest physicians had failed was spreading throughout the palace, and not everyone was pleased with this development. As Thomas left the medical wing that night, he was intercepted by 3 figures in the corridor: Dr. Zalthenis and 2 other high-ranking Draconian officials he didn't recognize. "Human," Dr. Zalthenis said, his voice cold. "We need to discuss your future role in the prince's treatment." Thomas stopped, suddenly aware that he might be walking into a trap. The corridor was empty except for the 4 of them, and the officials' expressions were far from friendly. "The prince is improving under the current treatment protocol," Thomas said carefully. "I recommend we continue." "That will no longer be necessary," one of the officials interrupted. He was an elderly dragon with silver scales and piercing blue eyes. "We have reviewed your methods and determined that we can manage the prince's care from this point forward." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Your Excellency, with respect, the prince is still recovering. Changing his treatment now could be dangerous." "Are you suggesting that Draconian physicians are incapable of monitoring a simple lighting schedule?" Dr. Zalthenis asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "No, but—" "Then there is no problem," the silver-scaled official said firmly. "You will return to your janitorial duties immediately. Your services are no longer required in the medical wing." Thomas realized what was happening. Now that his treatment was proving successful, the Draconian medical establishment wanted to take credit for the cure. They couldn't allow a human, a member of a lesser species, to be seen as the one who had saved the imperial heir. "The Emperor ordered me to oversee the prince's treatment," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The Emperor's orders were given in a moment of desperation," the 3rd official spoke for the first time. He was younger than the others, with deep red scales that marked him as a member of the royal bloodline. "Now that the crisis has passed, normal protocols will resume." Thomas looked between the 3 dragons, realizing he was in serious trouble. If they removed him from the prince's care and something went wrong with the treatment, he would be blamed for any setbacks. But if he continued to resist, they might take more drastic action to silence him permanently. "I understand," Thomas said finally. "But I request that you at least inform the Emperor of this change before implementing it." Dr. Zalthenis smiled coldly. "The Emperor need not be troubled with such minor administrative details. We will handle all aspects of the prince's care from now on." As Thomas walked back to the service levels, his mind raced. He had to find a way to protect both himself and the prince without directly defying these powerful officials. The young dragon was making progress, but his recovery was still fragile. Any disruption to his treatment could be catastrophic. Thomas spent a sleepless night considering his options. By morning, he had decided on a dangerous course of action. He would have to go directly to the Emperor and hope that the ruler's gratitude for his son's recovery would outweigh the political pressure from his advisors. But first, he had to make sure the prince's treatment continued uninterrupted, even if it meant risking everything he had worked for. Thomas arrived at the medical wing the next morning to find the corridor blocked by Imperial guards. The same senior guard who had originally tried to prevent him from entering now stood with arms crossed, his expression smugly satisfied. "You are not authorized to enter this area," the guard announced loudly enough for others to hear. By order of the Imperial Medical Council, all non-essential personnel are barred from the royal quarters. Thomas felt his stomach drop. "I need to check on the prince's treatment schedule. The lighting calibration requires daily adjustment." "That is no longer your concern, human." Dr. Zalthenis emerged from the prince's room, flanked by two assistants carrying monitoring equipment. He looked directly at Thomas with barely concealed triumph. "The prince's care has been returned to qualified medical professionals," the doctor announced. "Your primitive methods are no longer required." Thomas pushed down his rising panic and forced himself to think clearly. "Doctor, the treatment protocol requires gradual increases in exposure duration and intensity. If you disrupt the schedule now—" "Do not presume to lecture me about medical care," Dr. Zalthenis snapped. "I have been treating dragons for over 2 centuries. I hardly need instruction from a human janitor." Thomas realized that arguing with the doctor was pointless. These officials had already made their decision, and they weren't interested in hearing why it might be dangerous. He had only one option left, but it would require enormous courage. "I need to speak with the Emperor," Thomas said firmly. The guard laughed harshly. "The Emperor does not take audience requests from cleaning staff." "Then I'll wait until he comes to visit his son," Thomas replied. "I'll wait as long as it takes." Dr. Zalthenis's expression darkened. "You will return to your duties immediately, or you will be removed from the palace permanently." Thomas stood his ground. "The prince's life is more important than my job." For a moment, the corridor was silent, except for the hum of life support systems. Then Dr. Zalthenis gestured to the guards. "Escort this human off palace grounds. He is no longer employed here." As the guards moved toward him, Thomas heard a familiar voice roar from within the prince's room. "What is the meaning of this?" Emperor Vex Thanor's massive form filled the doorway, his golden eyes blazing with fury. The temperature in the corridor immediately rose several degrees as the great dragon's anger manifested in waves of heat. Everyone immediately dropped to their knees in submission, but Thomas remained standing. "Your Imperial Majesty," Dr. Zalthenis said quickly, "we were just removing this human as he is no longer needed for—" "Who authorized this removal?" the Emperor demanded, his voice like rumbling thunder. The silver-scaled official from the previous night stepped forward. "Your Majesty, the Imperial Medical Council felt it was time to resume normal treatment protocols. The human services are no longer required." "The human services are no longer required?" the Emperor repeated slowly, each word dripping with dangerous fury. "And who determined this?" "My lord, surely you agree that draconian physicians are better qualified to—" "I asked, who determined this?" the Emperor roared, and small flames began dancing around his massive jaws. Thomas stepped forward, knowing this might be his only chance to speak. "Your Majesty, they're trying to take over the prince's treatment. If they disrupt the lighting schedule now, it could be catastrophic for his recovery." Dr. Zalthenis rose from his kneeling position. "Your Majesty, the human exaggerates. We have carefully studied his methods and can replicate them perfectly." "Can you?" the Emperor asked quietly, and something in his tone made everyone in the corridor go very still. "Of course, my lord." "A simple lighting schedule is hardly beyond our capabilities." The Emperor nodded slowly. "Then you will not mind demonstrating your understanding. Tell me, what specific wavelength frequencies does my son require, and how must they be adjusted as his scales continue to develop?" Dr. Zalthenis opened his mouth confidently, then closed it again. The silence stretched uncomfortably. "Well?" the Emperor prompted. "My lord, The specific technical details are complex. We would need to review. Thomas, the Emperor said, not taking his eyes off the doctor, answer the same question. Thomas stepped forward. Your Majesty, the Prince currently requires a full-spectrum simulation of Zephyros Prime's star, but with elevated output in the ultraviolet range, specifically between 280 and 320 nanometers. As his scales mature, we'll need to gradually increase the intensity while shifting toward longer wavelengths in the red and infrared spectrum to support the development of his internal temperature regulation. The Emperor turned back to Dr. Zalthenis. Did you understand any of that? The doctor's scales had gone pale. My lord, we would of course consult with technical specialists to— Technical specialists, the Emperor repeated. You mean you would need to ask someone else how to treat my son? Your Majesty, the silver-scaled official interjected desperately. Surely you cannot seriously consider allowing a human to continue overseeing the heir's medical care. The political implications alone. The political implications. The Emperor's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. You are concerned about politics while my son lies recovering from an illness that nearly killed him? Emperor Vex Thanor took a step forward, and everyone except Thomas backed away instinctively. The great dragon's presence filled the corridor like a force of nature. Let me make the political implications very clear, the Emperor continued. This human, this member of what you consider a lesser species, succeeded where every physician in my empire failed. He identified a problem that none of you even considered, developed a treatment that is saving my son's life, and did so while asking nothing in return except the chance to help a sick child. The Emperor's gaze swept over the assembled officials. And your response to this is to remove him from my son's care so that you can take credit for his work. My lord, we never intended, Dr. Zalthenis began. Silence. The Emperor's roar shook the entire corridor, and the lights flickered as his fury reached dangerous levels. You intended exactly that, and we all know it. You cannot bear the thought that a human might be seen as superior to draconian medicine. Thomas watched in amazement as the most powerful ruler in the galaxy systematically dismantled the pretensions of his own officials. The Emperor's anger was magnificent and terrible to behold. Your Imperial Majesty, Thomas said quietly, if I may. The Emperor turned toward him, his expression softening slightly. Speak. The important thing right now is the Prince's continued recovery. The political questions can be settled later. But if his treatment is disrupted now, during this critical phase, it could set back his progress significantly. The Emperor nodded. Wise counsel. Thomas, you will continue to oversee my son's treatment until he is fully recovered. My lord, the red-scaled official protested. The precedent this sets— The precedent, the Emperor interrupted, is that in my empire, competence matters more than species, that results matter more than pride, that the welfare of my family, and by extension my people, comes before political convenience. Thomas felt a profound shift in the atmosphere of the corridor. The Emperor wasn't just defending his decision to keep Thomas on the medical team. He was making a statement about the fundamental nature of his rule. Furthermore, the Emperor continued, I am establishing a new position within the Imperial Medical Service. Thomas Chen will become the first director of interspecies medical research, with full authority to investigate and develop treatments that draw upon the knowledge and perspectives of all species within the Empire. The assembled officials looked stunned. Thomas felt his knees go weak as the implications of the Emperor's announcement sank in. Your Majesty, Thomas managed, I'm honored, but I'm not qualified for such a position. I'm just a janitor with some outdated medical training. The Emperor's expression almost resembled amusement. A janitor who saved my son's life when the entire Imperial Medical Service could not. I think you underestimate your qualifications. Dr. Zalthenis stepped forward, his professional pride clearly struggling with the new reality. Your Majesty, if I may, the human's methods, while unorthodox, have proven effective. Perhaps we could learn from his approach. Thomas looked at the doctor with surprise. It was the first time he had shown any willingness to acknowledge that Thomas might have something valuable to offer. An excellent suggestion, the Emperor replied. Dr. Zalthenis, you will serve as Thomas's liaison to the traditional medical establishment. Together, you will develop protocols that combine the best of both approaches. The doctor bowed, his expression suggesting he was still processing this dramatic change in circumstances. Now, the Emperor said, I believe my son requires his morning treatment. Thomas nodded and moved toward the prince's room, followed by Dr. Zalthenis and a much subdued group of medical staff. The guards and officials dispersed quickly, clearly eager to avoid any further imperial displeasure. Inside the room, Prince Kylvex was awake and alert, his bright eyes tracking movement around him with obvious intelligence. His scales had continued to improve overnight, showing deeper hints of their natural crimson color. Good morning, Your Highness, Thomas said softly as he began calibrating the lighting system. To his amazement, the young dragon turned toward his voice and made a soft trilling sound that sounded almost like a greeting. Dr. Zalthenis stepped beside Thomas, watching the calibration process intently. These wavelength adjustments, he said quietly. How did you determine the proper settings? Thomas showed him the control interface, explaining his methodology. It's based on spectral analysis of natural sunlight, cross-referenced with what I could learn about dragon physiology. A lot of it was educated guesswork at first, but the prince's responses have guided the adjustments. The doctor nodded thoughtfully. Empirical observation combined with theoretical analysis. Not so different from traditional medical practice, just approaching from a different angle. As Thomas activated the morning light treatment, Prince Kylvex stretched his small wings and chirped contentedly. The improvement over the previous week was remarkable. The young dragon was clearly stronger and more responsive with each passing day. Dr. Zalthenis, Thomas said as they watched the prince bask in the simulated sunlight. I hope you understand that I never intended to undermine your authority or expertise. I just saw a problem that needed solving. The doctor was quiet for a long moment. Your species, he said finally, approaches problems differently than we do. Dragons are taught to trust in established knowledge and proven methods. You seem to instinctively question everything and look for new solutions. Is that a bad thing? Thomas asked. I thought so, Dr. Zalthenis admitted. But watching the prince's recovery, perhaps there is value in combining our approaches. Your willingness to challenge assumptions with our depth of medical knowledge. Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself in an entirely new role within the palace. No longer an invisible janitor, he now worked alongside the Empire's most skilled physicians, developing new treatment protocols that drew upon insights from multiple species. The prince's recovery accelerated dramatically. Within a month, he was sitting up on his own and taking solid food. His scales had regained their full crimson brilliance, and his personality began to emerge, playful, curious, and remarkably intelligent even for a young dragon. Emperor Vex Thanor spent increasing amounts of time in the medical wing, not out of worry now, but out of joy in watching his son's development. The transformation in the great ruler was as remarkable as his son's recovery. The desperate, angry dragon who had nearly executed Thomas for presumption had been replaced by a father delighted in his child's progress. Thomas, the Emperor said one evening as they watched Prince Kylvex practice flying around his room with gradually strengthening wings, your species continues to surprise me. How so, Your Majesty? When we conquered your worlds, we saw humans as weak. No natural weapons, no inherent powers, easily defeated in conventional warfare. We assumed you were simply inferior. Thomas waited, sensing the Emperor had more to say. But we failed to understand your true strength, the Emperor continued. You don't give up. When faced with an impossible problem, you don't accept that it's unsolvable. You find new approaches, challenge assumptions, persist when others would surrender. The Emperor turned his massive head toward Thomas. Perhaps that is why your species has not only survived conquest, but begun to thrive within our empire. You adapt, you learn, you contribute in ways we never expected. Thomas considered the Emperor's words carefully. Your Majesty, I think every species has unique strengths. Dragons have power and wisdom that humans can barely comprehend, but maybe our strength is that we never stop trying to understand and improve things. Indeed, the Emperor mused, and perhaps that is a strength we have lost in our dominance. When you have the power to crush any opposition, you may forget the value of persistence in the face of adversity. Prince Kylvex, overhearing their conversation, glided over and perched on Thomas's shoulder with surprising grace. The young dragon nuzzled against Thomas's cheek, chirping affectionately. I believe, the Emperor said with what Thomas had learned to recognize as draconian amusement, that my son has adopted you. Thomas gently stroked the prince's scales, marveling at how far they had all come from that first desperate night. The feeling is mutual, Your Majesty. 3 months later, Thomas stood before the Imperial Council as Emperor Vex Thanor formally announced the establishment of the Interspecies Medical Research Division. The new department would investigate medical challenges from the perspectives of all species within the Empire, combining traditional knowledge with innovative approaches. Furthermore, the Emperor declared to the assembled nobles and officials, I am hereby instituting new policies regarding the treatment of all species within our empire. No longer will competence and contribution be overshadowed by species origin. Merit will be the primary criterion for advancement and recognition. The announcement sent shockwaves through the draconian hierarchy, but the Emperor's word was absolute law. Thomas watched from the gallery as centuries of rigid species-based discrimination began to crumble in the face of one simple demonstration. Sometimes the most important solutions come from the most unexpected sources. Later that evening, Thomas found himself back in Prince Kylvex's room, now completely transformed from a medical facility into a proper nursery. The young dragon was playing with holographic toys, his energy and enthusiasm a joy to witness. Thomas, Prince Kylvex said, using the clear bell-like voice that had developed as his health returned. Will you tell me a story about humans? Thomas smiled and settled into a chair beside the prince's play area. What kind of story would you like to hear, Your Highness? A story about how humans solve problems, the prince replied immediately. Father says you're very good at that. As Thomas began telling the story of how humans had learned to fly by studying birds, he reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he had been an invisible janitor in the palace of his species' conquerors. Now he was a trusted advisor to the emperor and surrogate uncle to the imperial heir. But more importantly, he had helped prove something that would reshape the entire empire. That wisdom and insight could come from anywhere, that every species had something valuable to contribute, and that sometimes the most powerful act was simply refusing to give up when others said a problem couldn't be solved. Prince Kylvex fell asleep during the story, curled up contentedly in his bed with scales that gleamed like polished rubies in the gentle light. Thomas quietly adjusted the room's lighting to the nighttime setting he had developed, a soft, warm glow that mimicked the natural rhythms of day and night. As he prepared to leave, Thomas noticed a message waiting on his personal communicator. It was from the Human Colony Administration, responding to a report he had sent weeks earlier about improved conditions for humans within the Draconian Empire. The message was brief but profound. Your actions have given hope to humans across the galaxy. We are no longer seen merely as a conquered species, but as valuable contributors to galactic civilization. Thank you for reminding everyone that humanity's greatest strength has never been our technology or our weapons. It's our refusal to accept that any problem is truly unsolvable. Thomas smiled and quietly left the prince's room, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to bridge the gap between species. The young dragon who had nearly died from a simple deficiency was now a symbol of what could be achieved when different perspectives worked together. In the corridors of the palace that had once been a symbol of human subjugation, Thomas walked with the confidence of someone who had learned that sometimes the most important victories were won not through strength or dominance, but through compassion, persistence, and the simple refusal to accept that a sick child couldn't be healed. The Dragon Emperor's ailing child had indeed been overlooked by everyone, until a human janitor proved that sometimes the most powerful medicine was nothing more than refusing to give up hope.